A poor boy stands in front of a large mansion on a hill, where it is rumored that the owner is an eccentric millionaire who trusts no one but himself. One day, he breaks that boundary by fixing a broken car, but he does not expect that small act to lead him on a life-changing journey. A big storm comes, water floods the basement of the mansion, and the boy risks everything to save what to others may be just mindless machines. No one in town understands why he is so reckless, until they hear his name on national television. That is the moment everyone realizes kindness can save not only a person, but ourselves. Scene 3. Welcome, kids, to Kindness Stories, where stories of kindness will warm your heart. Today, let's explore the extraordinary journey of a brave poor boy who used kindness to change his own life, and also a lonely millionaire. Maple Hollow is nestled on a winding dirt road in the mountains, where the only sounds of life are usually birdsong and passing trucks. It is a small, peaceful but hard-hitting town, where tiny houses line the main street. Many of the homes have faded windows, cracked brick walls, and the sidewalks are littered with grass growing through the cracks. In the poor neighborhood in the south of town, there lived a boy named Eli Walker. Eli was 12 years old, small but bright-eyed, as if he always saw the good things that others did not notice. His messy black hair seemed never to be combed, and his old clothes were faded with time. Eli's mother, Mrs. Sarah Walker, was a single woman, busy every day with the job of cleaning houses for the well-off families in town. Life was not easy, but both mother and son always tried to stay optimistic. That afternoon, Eli was returning from the grocery store with his shopping bags when he saw a shiny black luxury car stopped at the side of the road. It was a fancy sports car, the kind he had only seen on TV. In front of it, a man was leaning over, looking confused as he stared at the engine. Eli recognized him as Mr. Henry Lawson, a man the town often talked about. They called him the eccentric man in the mansion because he lived alone in a large house on the western hill. No one really knew what he did, only that he was a wealthy businessman who had retired from business after an unexplained family incident. Rumor had it that Mr. Henry hated interacting with strangers, and that he even had cameras installed around his house. Eli hesitated. He had heard many scary rumors about Mr. Henry, but seeing the man with the sweat-stained white shirt, he hesitated for a few seconds before deciding to step forward. "Can I help?" Eli asked hesitantly. Mr. Henry raised his head, his stern eyes sweeping over him. "No need, kid. It's an adult matter," he said curtly. "I used to help my mom fix her old washing machine. Maybe I can help," Eli tried to persuade, his voice a mixture of confidence and nervousness. Henry narrowed his eyes, then sighed. "If you can figure it out in 5 minutes, I'll let you try." Eli squatted down beside the car, peering carefully at the engine. He found a loose belt, and with his small hands he tried to get his fingers into the tight spot to adjust it. After a few minutes he stood up, dusted his hands off, and said, "I think it's working." Mr. Henry started the car. The engine hummed and sounded smooth. A surprised frown crossed his face. Smarter than he looks," he muttered, and climbed into the car, saying nothing more, just nodding to Eli in a brief thank you. Eli smiled. "Have a safe trip," he said before turning and walking home. Little did he know that this small encounter would change his life forever. A week had passed since Eli had helped Mr. Henry fix his car. He went to school every day, helped his mother clean the house, and helped the neighbors when he could. Eli's mother, Sarah, had always told him to keep his distance from strangers, especially rich people. But every time he walked up the hill, Eli would look up at Mr. Henry's huge mansion, and one day, as Eli was coming home from school, he saw Mr. Henry trying to carry a large box from the car into the house. The box was so big and heavy that he had to stop and rest. "You need help?" Eli asked, this time without hesitation like before. Henry glanced at him, looking hesitant, but this time he nodded. "If you think you can do it, give it a try." Eli quickly ran over, using both hands to support one corner of the box. With the coordination of both, they brought the box into the mansion. When the door opened, Eli saw the inside of the house. It was not the beautifully decorated and tidy house he had expected. The floor was littered with mechanical tools, blueprints were scattered everywhere, and in the middle of the room was a large workbench with small metal parts. "What are you doing?" Eli asked, looking curiously at the desk. "I fixed a battery to filter out the corrosive electronics." Henry did not answer immediately, but after a moment of silence, he replied curtly, "Making something you don't understand." "But I can try," Eli said, approaching a small model of what looked like a strange machine. He tilted his head to examine it, pointing to a loose joint. "This one seems misaligned. If you try to attach it like this, it will get stuck when it turns." Henry paused, looking at Eli with a more serious look. He stepped forward, looked at the machine, and realized he was right. End quote. "You think you're so good?" he asked, his voice both sarcastic and curious. "I'm not good at it, I fix old things for my mom. Sometimes it just takes a little redo," Eli said. Not bragging, just the truth. Henry was silent, watching Eli intently. Finally, he took out a piece of paper and wrote down a simple mechanical problem. He handed it to Eli. "Solve this. If you solve it, I will show you something you have never seen before." Eli sat down at the table, hesitated for a moment, then began scribbling numbers. Henry stood behind him with his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving the boy. 10 minutes passed, and Eli looked up and handed the paper to him. Henry took it, examined it, and then chuckled. "Not bad. You're better than I thought." Exercise. From that day on, Eli became a regular visitor to Mr. Henry. Despite Mrs. Sarah's prohibition, Eli still secretly went. He found Mr. Henry not scary, but a treasure trove of knowledge. Every time he came, he learned more about gears, engines, and mechanics. But this is where the conflict began. Mrs. Sarah discovered that Eli was still secretly visiting Mr. Henry and angrily forbade him from coming. "He's just using you, Eli," she yelled. "Rich people don't really care about you. They don't want your help because they don't want you they can't do without you. They take advantage of you. It's like abusive childhoods." Rich people were being trashed. Eli didn't know what to do. He loved learning, but he didn't want to upset his mother. He was conflicted. Could he prove to his mother that Mr. Henry wasn't a bad person? Dara held out her hand. Little did he know that the coming days would bring the greatest challenge of his life. Gray clouds rolled in, darkening the sky as if it were about to swallow Maple Hollow. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches crackle. The storm had come unexpectedly in the late afternoon. Rain poured down hard on Sarah's old roof. Water dripped through the holes in the roof and streamed down to the floor. "Relly, get a basin of water," Sarah cried out hurriedly, using a towel to wipe up the water and looking up at the ceiling helplessly. "Yes, I'm getting it." Eli quickly found plastic tubs and empty buckets and placed them under the leaks. The storm intensified. Thunder rumbled, and each time lightning struck, flashes of light briefly illuminated the room, revealing Sarah's weary face. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and her anxiety continued to grow. The electricity was cut off, leaving only the dim light of small candles. In the middle of that, Eli suddenly remembered something. Mr. Henry's mansion. "Mom, something must have happened to Mr. Henry's house, too. I think he might need help," he said, his voice full of worry. "Why do you think he must have died then?" "No, Eli, don't go out in this storm," Sarah snapped. "I forbid you to leave the house." Her words were crude. "But he's alone, Mom. If the basement floods, all his machines will be ruined." Eli looked at his mother with pleading eyes. "I'll be right back." Sarah looked serious, but she was worried. However, she shook her head and insisted on keeping her son. But Eli couldn't sit still. He knew that Mr. Henry's basement was full of electronics. If water got in, everything would be ruined. After a few minutes of debating, he decided to help Mr. Henry, despite his mother's warning. While Mrs. Sarah was busy mopping up the water, Eli quietly opened the back door and rushed out into the pouring rain. He ran down the street, his old shoes sinking into puddles. Eli's shirt was soaked, the cold rain seeping into his skin, but he didn't stop. Along the way, he saw broken branches lying around, several houses with slightly flooded front yards. In the lightning, Mr. Henry's villa loomed on the hill. Eli pointed his foot toward the fortress, keeping it moving until he could see people moving inside. Eli knocked on the door, but no one answered. He tried again. "Mr. Henry, are you in there?" he shouted, his voice mixing with the sound of wind and rain. The door was unlocked. Eli pushed it open and immediately heard the sound of rushing water. He rushed down to the basement. His eyes widened as he saw that the water was almost ankle deep. Mr. Henry was sitting at his desk, frantically lifting electronic components out of the water, but some of them were already soaked. "Do you need help?" Eli shouted, his voice lost in the thunder. "Really? Why are you here?" Mr. Henry was surprised, glaring at him. But he had no time to be angry. "Let me help you." Eli rolled up his sleeves and waded into the water. He carefully lifted the small machines onto high shelves. "If we don't move quickly, the water will destroy everything." "You think I don't know?" Mr. Henry sighed. But this time he didn't nag. He pointed to the shelf. "Put those machines on the table. Careful, they're heavy." The two worked together. Under the flickering light of the lightning, Eli and Mr. Henry worked tirelessly. Eli quickly used old cloths to block the water flowing in through the cracks of the door. Every time the water rose, he used a broom to sweep the water out. As the water began to recede, Mr. Henry sank back into his chair, breathing a sigh of relief. "I thought I had lost everything," he said quietly. "I thought—" Mr. Henry started. "But you still have the machines. You still have the ideas," Eli replied, wiping the water from his face. "We've saved a lot." Mr. Henry turned to look at Eli, his eyes thoughtful. This was the first time Eli saw his eyes were no longer cold, but warm and full of gratitude. "You're right," he said slowly, "and you're a lot better than people think." The next day, the sky was clear. Maple Hollow was in ruins. Many houses were flooded, roofs were torn off, tree branches were strewn across the streets. People were cleaning up, helping each other. In Sarah's small house, a confrontation was taking place. "Do you know how worried I was, Eli?" Sarah crossed her arms over her chest, her face showing disappointment. "I know, Mom." Eli bowed his head. "But if I don't go, everything of Mr. Henry's will be destroyed." "It doesn't matter to us, Eli," Sarah snapped. "You're everything to me, and I'm not going to lose you to some weirdo." "Mom, he's not what people think," Eli countered. "Mr. Henry taught me a lot, not just about machines, but about how to look at things. If I can help someone, why wouldn't I?" Sarah was silent. She knew her son was right, but the fear of losing him was always in her heart. She sighed, pulled Eli back, and hugged him. "You're so stubborn, just like your father," she said, her eyes slightly watering. "But I'm proud of you." A few days later, there was a surprise. Mr. Henry showed up at Sarah's door. He was carrying a bag of tools. "Mrs. Walker," he said, his voice calm, "I hear your house has a leak." Mrs. Sarah was surprised. "What?" "What do you want?" "Just wanted to return the favor." Mr. Henry smiled, a rare smile. "Your son taught me a lesson, and I think I owe him one." From then on, Mr. Henry was no longer the freak in the mansion. He gradually integrated into the community. Mrs. Sarah took on the job of cleaning Mr. Henry's house, and Eli officially became his student. From a poor boy that no one paid attention to, Eli is now someone that everyone in town knows. Little by little, the two learned to trust each other, and their relationship became not just that of teacher and student, but that of family. The moral of the story is clear. Kindness can melt the loneliest walls, and sometimes a poor boy can become the inspiration for a lost millionaire. End of chapter 15, recording by James Costello. Spring has returned to the town of Maple Hollow. Cherry blossoms are beginning to bloom on the trees along the roadside. The golden sunlight filters through the leaves, bringing warmth that chases away the cold memories of the recent storm. Life in the town slowly returns to normal, but one thing has changed forever: the relationship between Mr. Henry Lawson and the Eli Walker family. After the storm, Mr. Henry was no longer the freak in the mansion. He became a part of the town. Every morning, people saw him going to the market, sometimes even helping an old lady carry a heavy bag. People no longer avoided him like before, and he did not hide in the mansion like before. He was different. At Henry's villa, the sound of hammering and metal clashing resounded regularly every day, but this time he did not work alone. Eli had become his little assistant. The boy now not only knew how to fix old things, but also learned how to assemble complex electronic modules. With his skillful hands and intelligence, Eli never stopped surprising Mr. Henry. "Are you sure this will work, Mr. Henry?" Eli asked, eyeing the small cylindrical machine that sat on the workbench. "More than anything, kid," Henry replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "But if I'm wrong, that's a lesson. I'll try it." Eli pressed the switch. A beep sounded, and the little machine rolled across the table, spinning around before coming to a neat stop. Then the pieces moved as one, going where they were supposed to. Eli chuckled with delight. "It worked." Henry smiled. "Yes, and it's all thanks to you, Eli." Both men sat down and looked at the machine. Mr. Henry did not say it, but he knew in his heart that it was this boy who gave him the motivation to complete this project. The machine was not just a device, but a symbol of his new beginning. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. One morning, a shiny silver car with the logo of the national television pulled up in front of Mr. Henry's villa. Two reporters got out of the car with a cameraman, walked to the front door, and knocked. Eli and Sarah saw the scene from a distance as they returned from the market. "What is going on?" Eli wondered. "You better not come any closer," Sarah reminded him, but she was curious too. About an hour later, Mr. Henry's door opened. He walked out with a serious but nervous expression. He saw Eli standing in the distance and waved slightly. Mr. Henry waved back, but didn't go in. He looked around the conference room and walked away, leaving the door open behind him. "Eli, come here," he called out. Eli ran over, a little confused. What am I doing?" "You're going to be on TV," Henry winked, a rare warm smile on his face. "And I want you standing next to me." Eli couldn't believe his ears, but Mr. Henry pulled him closer. The reporter turned to look at the two and smiled. "Huh?" "Oh, Mr. Henry," the reporter asked, the cameras rolling, "it seems like your new invention has been recognized by the community. Can you tell the audience who inspired you to create this machine?" Mr. Henry was silent for a moment, his eyes glancing at Eli. The boy stood beside him, trying not to move too much. Then he spoke slowly, word by word, clearly and sincerely. "My inspiration is a boy I underestimated," he said, turning to Eli. His name is Eli Walker. He reminded me that no matter how rich or poor you are, sometimes kindness and perseverance can change everything. Not only did he save my machine from the storm, but he reminded me that no one is too small to create great things. Eli stood there, eyes wide, staring at Henry, his throat tight. Sarah stood nearby, her hand over her mouth to hide her sobs. The crowd of townspeople gathered nearby, watching the touching moment. Everyone looked at Eli with admiration. Eli. And to honor his kindness, I decided to establish a scholarship fund for needy children, Mr. Henry continued. It will be called the Eli Walker Fund, in memory of this young boy's courage, kindness, and intelligence. The townspeople applauded loudly. Mrs. Sarah burst into tears, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she did not bother to wipe them away. She looked at her son with the proudest eyes. This was her son, a boy with a kind heart, a boy who had changed the life of a wealthy but lonely man. Pierre. Eli was still confused. He turned to Mr. Henry and asked quietly, "Are you sure? My name? For that fund? For you?" "Certainly," Mr. Henry replied, stroking his head. "And if anyone disagrees, I will tell them that I learned my lesson from you." He walked. That evening, Mr. Henry invited Mrs. Sarah and Eli to dinner at his villa. For the first time, his house was no longer cold, but filled with laughter. Mrs. Sarah and Mr. Henry talked about life, while Eli kept staring at the machine that he and Mr. Henry had created together. "Now this house looks like a family," Sarah remarked, glancing at Henry. "Yeah, a real family," Mr. Henry agreed, his voice much warmer. Eli looked up at both adults. "Family?" He smiled brightly. "I like that word." That dinner may not have been a lavish affair, but for Eli, it was the best moment of his life. No money, no big mansion. What he got was much more precious. Love, hope, and a real family. The story ends with Henry, Sarah, and Eli sitting at the dinner table talking about new projects. A poor boy, a lonely millionaire, and a single mother, three seemingly unrelated people, but thanks to kindness, they become a family. The message is clear. Kindness can turn ordinary things into extraordinary ones. And sometimes, a poor boy is the one who brings a ray of light to a lost millionaire. Today's story shows us that sometimes just a small action can make a big change. Kindness not only brings happiness to others, but also helps us become stronger. If you ever think you are too small to make a difference, remember Eli, the boy who inspired an entire town. Don't forget that kindness is always present around us, as long as you are willing to give. Thank you for following Kindness Stories. See you again in the next stories about love and kindness.